Welcome back to Estonian Unlocked. In this video, I will cover using verbs in a sentence, specifically whether or not you should use the MA or the DA verb endings. To understand this, we first need to understand infinitives. In English, we say to love. This is the infinitive form of the verb. In Estonian, there are two types of infinitive, the first infinitive and the second infinitive. The first infinitive always ends with the letters MA. The second infinitive is also called the DA infinitive, but it can also end with TA or just A. Think of the to part in to love as the endings in these infinitives, the MAs or the DAs. Since there are two of them in Estonian, when we say to love in a sentence, we have to decide which one of the infinitives do we use. That's what this video is about. Since the second infinitive can end in various ways, it's important that every time you memorize a verb, you memorize the first infinitive and the second infinitive. I also recommend learning the conjugation stem and the to form of the verb. That way you have all your bases covered and you can build any other forms of the verb based off of those forms. For now, if you're speaking in Estonian and you are trying to come up with the second infinitive, I recommend just swapping out the MA for the DA. Oftentimes, you'll be right if you switch out the MA for the DA. If you're wrong, the person will either correct you and then you'll learn the word, or they won't understand you, then you can say the MA, and then they can either correct you or you can ask them, hey, how do I say that correctly? And then from there, you can write it down or put it in the notes app on your phone and learn these words as they come. However, if you memorize all of these forms of the verbs, then you shouldn't have to keep asking people to give you that infinitive form. You should just know it. And the more that you learn verbs with all of these forms, you'll start to get better acquainted with how these words change in their different forms. And you'll get better and better at guessing over time until you won't really have to memorize all these forms anymore. You'll just kind of have an idea of what these patterns are. At the beginning, it's kind of counterintuitive and you're not really sure what you're doing. So definitely start by memorizing all these forms. So the question is, when do we use the MA or the DA ending? And here's the rule. In a sentence, only one verb can be conjugated to the subject. When we conjugate, we use the MA verb ending as our base to build our stem. And so that's when we use the MA. Any other verbs in the sentence are secondary verbs. And because of that, we use the second infinitive form. So if our sentence structure is pronoun, conjugated verb, and then infinitive verb, we use the second infinitive for that verb ending. An example of this pattern would be, we love to sing. In eesti keeles, we would say, meie armastame laulda. We, to love, conjugated to we. Remember, we use that MA infinitive to build that conjugation stem. And then laulda, the VA or the second infinitive form of to sing. Now that we know the rule, let's get some practice in. On the left, we have this word bank. We have the word in English, and then the MA infinitive, the conjugation stem, and then the DA infinitive. On the right, we have these example sentences in that same order: pronoun, conjugated verb, second infinitive verb ending. And I want you to go ahead and practice these based off of the word bank. Practice conjugating your verbs and then using the second infinitive in the sentence. Go ahead and pause the video, and I'll meet you back here when you're done. And here are the translations. So I want to teach. Mina tahan õpetada. You love to run. Sina armastad joosta. And so on and so forth. Now that we know the rule and we know how to apply this rule, we're going to move into some of the exceptions. Now, as you are speaking to Estonians, 90% of the time, you're going to be following this rule. 10% of it, you're going to run into some of these exceptions. If you miss the exceptions and you just follow the rule, they're probably going to understand you still. But if you catch the exceptions and you get it right on those 10% of the time, that is when Estonians are going to be especially impressed with you, because honestly, most people don't make it this far. So if you've been following along with this video and things are making sense, congratulations, you've made it further than most people. Let's move on to some exceptions. Before we do that, if you're finding this video useful, please give me a thumbs up and let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. Now for the exceptions. Certain verbs and words are what I like to call MA forcers. These words force you to break this rule and use the first infinitive instead of the second infinitive for the second verb in the sentence. So if you dig into a textbook, you can start to find some of these little details of what kinds of words are MA forcers and their characteristics so that you can have a kind of general idea of what's out there and what to be looking out for. But honestly, in a practical sense, that hasn't really worked for me. And I found that for me, at least, it's been useful every time I hear a word that I realize, oh, that is causing me to break this rule. That has to be an MA forcer. I just kind of compile them into this list and then I go home and study them and start practicing them in sentences. And then over time, they just become incorporated into the way that I speak. And so I started this little list here for you on the bottom left. You can see most of these are verbs, and then the bottom two are not verbs. But oftentimes it's going to be verbs. And I really don't want anybody to get confused by this because it's kind of a nuanced exception as we look into this of what this exception really means and how it's actually applied. So what this exception is not is every time you see one of these words here on the left, it is in the MA infinitive. It's not that. All of these words, all of these verbs at least, have first infinitive, second infinitive, conjugation, to, nude, passive voice, all of these different forms for them, just like any other verb. However, if they show up in a sentence, they are going to follow the rule, but they force other verbs to break the rule. Let's talk about what that means. So again, we've got some examples here. Think about how I've explained this exception so far and give it a go. Try to translate out these sentences and pause the video and I'll meet you back here. Okay, here are the translations. Let's go over each one of these so that I can make sure that you're really understanding this. So this first one, I am ready to sleep. First verb in the sentence, to be, I am. So that's olema. We have that conjugated here, ma olen, valmis, and there's our red flag. There's our exception, valmis. To sleep. So normally we would use the second infinitive, which ends with da, magada. But because we have this valmis, it is forcing us to change to sleep into its MA infinitive, magama. That's the MA forcer there. That's the exception. This next sentence, they will teach me to read. Not epetavad means lugema. Same thing going on here. We have epetavad, which is our MA forcer here, epetama, to teach. And that is forcing the next verb in the sentence to become the first infinitive instead of the second infinitive. That first verb is, or that next verb in the sentence is to read. And the first infinitive form of to read is lugema. That's why the sentence is the way it is. This next one, I want to go. This follows the rule. Ma tahan minma. Tahma, to want, is not an MA forcer. And so that means that to go is in its second infinitive form, which happens to end with just the name. I really want to make sure that you understand this, that minama, to go, just because to go shows up in the sentence doesn't mean it comes in the first infinitive. These MA forcers force other words to break the rule. They do not break the rule unless they're being forced by one of their own. That is why we have minma in its second infinitive here instead of minema, because it's following the rule. The next sentence here, you must start to work. Now we have 3 verbs in this sentence. The first verb, must, so we conjugate that to the pronoun you, sa, bead, and that's our pidama over there on our list on the left. That we know is going to force the next verb into the MA infinitive. So start would be hakama. You must start sa bead hakama. You must start to work. Well, hakama is both being forced into the first infinitive, so it's being acted on by one of these MA enforcers, but now it's also an MA enforcer, so it's going to force the next verb in the sentence to be in the MA infinitive. That's why next we have töötama, the work. So sa pead hakkama töötama. You must start the work. And our last sentence here, you want to start the work, shows what it would be like if we didn't have an MA enforcer as that first verb in the sentence. So sa tahad is you want, and tahma, again, is not an MA forcer. So the next verb to start is not going to be in the MA infinitive. It's going to follow the rule and be in the second infinitive. So you want to start tatahat, but since to start or begin is an MA forcer, it takes that next verb in the sentence to the MA infinitive or the first infinitive, which is törtama. Hopefully these exceptions are making sense to you. They actually come up pretty frequently, but like I said, 90% of the time we are going to be following that rule. And the rule is that the first verb of the sentence is conjugated to the subject with the MA infinitive. And the second verb of the sentence or any secondary verbs after that are in the second infinitive form, which often ends with the DA. It can also end with the TA or A. Be sure, like I said, that you are memorizing all the forms of these verbs. It will help you 1,000% later. If you memorize these verbs in their first infinitive, conjugation stem, second infinitive, and tude form, if you get all of those down, you're going to be able to build all the different forms of these verbs later, and it's going to save you the headache of trying to then go back and relearn all of these words because you didn't fully learn them the first time. I hope this video was helpful for you. If you got value out of this, please give me a thumbs up. If you have things that you want me to cover, let me know in the comments below, and I will try to pump out some more videos for you guys soon. Thanks, and nagamis.